Okay, students, so this is the last part, and I'm going to go through the notes that I made with you, trying not to repeat what I've already told you. I'm just going through the notes. So the first thing is that I notice here, if I go sequentially through my notes, is the issue of Antwone and this relationship he has with the woman, and then also his fear of intimacy, and therefore I've already mentioned his lack of or hesitance to show vulnerability as well. So these are two things that I really want you to kind of look at when you assess specifically the embedded beliefs, and I've showed you here the beliefs and the values and the habitual ways of coping that Antwone has developed here. So you will go, if you go through this material, you will see that this structure or diagram is used often to explain a specific person's story in terms of beliefs, values, and coping. And then around that, there's also feelings now, and that is in the middle. So your beliefs, your values, and your habitual way of coping will influence the type of feelings you have. So you will see, coincidentally, there's also feelings of shame and rage. And I think this is exactly what Antwone experienced. He had rage in him. He was angry quite a lot. That's why he was violent. But he also had a deep, deep sense of shame. And that is why he was reluctant to be in an intimate relationship with anyone. And again, I don't know if I said this, but remember, intimacy is really a description of the degree and the type of relationship you have with someone, and then also your willingness to be vulnerable in front of that someone, because if you're not willing to be vulnerable, then you cannot be intimate with anyone. And I'm not talking about physical intimacy. I'm talking specifically about intimacy in a relationship. What does that mean? It means to show who you are. It shows your fears, your dreams, your longings, your weaknesses, your skills without boasting, and your need for belonging and love, acceptance, and support. And I think in essence, this is what Antwone did not want to do. And that's why it took him quite a long time to get things started with this lady. And it's also why Davenport kind of motivated that relationship, because he knew that is exactly what Antwone needs, a relationship of intimacy. And even Davenport and Antwone created or developed a intimate relationship. So please look at those two concepts as well in terms of that specific diagram. And then also when you look at your theological reflection, and this is something I didn't mention, but your theological reflection is very, very important. And it's normally the one section that students do not elaborate on because it's a secular movie. But as we've discussed in the class the other day, there are so many symbols and metaphors, and I think things that you can use for a theology. So although religion and Christianity is never mentioned in the movie, there are so much religious symbols, and which we can assume feeds into that theological or theologies or lived theologies, life-limiting and life-giving theologies. So look at the theologies that both Davenport and Antwone holds. Read that section as well. In the prescribed book, it's not exploring lived theologies, but yeah, co-creating postmodern lived theologies, theology of broken symbols, thinking about suffering and evil, and then those theologies specifically. And a lot of you mentioned the moral theology, the redemptive theology. And remember now what I said is that, and I don't know if I'm right, but I've got this sense in myself that, Antwone was the offer, the sacrifice for the sins of the people in his lives. So there is a redemptive aspect for me as well within his lived theology. So please take a look at that. I just want to make this a little bit smaller because I'm sure you can see quite clearly here. So it says here, theologies of redemption are another common way of understanding suffering. They are especially helpful in long-term meaning-making process of spiritual care when care seekers look back retrospectively and see that in spite of the horror of suffering, they survived. And that is something that is definitely visible through Antwone, although he does not state it. He intentionally, I think, lives a theology now that says despite his suffering, he survived. Despite his suffering, there was grace shown to him through Davenport, through his girlfriend, and so forth. Eschatologies of hope as well, you mentioned. That's very true. And then also don't miss theology of lament and protest. And go read a little bit on what is meant by lamenting. Now, lamenting is a very important Christian spiritual practice. That is what the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews, everyone did, was to lament. And lamenting is very, very important in the face of loss. How did Antwone lament? How did he protest against the suffering that he experienced? So take a little look at that as well, as from the beginning, and also how it changed, how he lamented or protested, and maybe he protested in the beginning and then lamented later on. And then also theologies of ambiguous suffering. And now I want you to kind of listen to, you remember we said when he visited his mother, there was something in Antwone that showed compassion and wisdom that he previously did not have. So he kind of thought he was the only one suffering. And it's as if he realized in that moment that this person, his mother, who he blames so much, might even suffer more than he did and does. Might not have had the opportunities that he had at that moment with Davenport and the girlfriend. So look a little bit at that ambiguous suffering and how we understand that. Okay, I said respecting the mystery of the other, because someone mentioned spiritual wounds and the healing, and that's true. What spiritual wounds did Antwone attain, and then how did he come to healing? I've already now spoken enough on the model of care. And what Le Bohan also said here is that in his narrative assessment, experience that affect him, physical and emotionally and sexually abuse, exposed him to hatred of the self. Now, hatred of the self, that is an embedded belief. So explore that a little bit. And how did that hatred develop from his systemic assessment? Crossing boundaries, build a wall to protect himself. And I said here that Antwone was in actual fact, by building a wall or even a fort to protect himself, he isolated himself, but then he became his own prisoner, almost that prisoner in the mind. And because he deprived, by being distrustful, by not being willing to be vulnerable, he deprived himself of a community of belonging. Because I do think that the military context, and some people in the military context, wanted or included Antwone in opportunities where he could belong, but he resisted to be vulnerable in front of them. That's why he fought so much. Then somebody said inability to love or relate. And I want to reflect on that critically by saying that does anyone have an inability to love? I think it's actually our ability and our unconscious ability to love that causes us harm and suffering. That causes us to isolate, that causes us to build a wall, to not trust anyone and not allow anyone in. So I would critically reflect on that inability to love. I don't think that is possible, but if you disagree with me, please explain why. So his relationship with the therapist, now we spoke of that as well, which, and I made 3 points here. This is under Le Bohang's presentation. 1, developed dependency. 2, unforgiveness. 3, helplessness. And I think that relationship with the therapist helped him a lot with that. But I do not think he developed dependency on the therapist. I think initially, if you look at that, it might seem that way. But I don't think so, because, he was afraid of rejection. And when the therapist, Davenport, ended the sessions, now we've already concluded that that was the end of the therapeutic relationship, but the beginning of the parental relationship. Now, so when he ended the relationship, Antwone was triggered again by that habitual ways of believing the values he has, and then coping by feeling rejected. But I do not think he ever became dependent on him as such. And remember, anger is also a sign of a loss of control. Now, whenever anyone gets angry, especially when you become violent, verbally, emotionally, or physically, it's always a sign that you are out of control. And that is also ironic, because people become violent because they want to get control back, but it has the opposite effect. It shows people that you do not have control internally as well. So theological assessment, I said, is very important, the Dent theology view of God. And you reflect on that as well, in terms of, you remember we talked about the men and the masculine symbols and metaphors we had in the movie. Reflect on that, on how do you think it influences his view of God as well in your theological reflection, and why that is important. Why your view of God or understanding of God is important for life-giving or life-limiting theology. Yes, and that whole thing of, you remember that Antwone lost his parents, but Davenport lost a child, or the future of, or the hope in a child, and how these two narratives intersect with each other as well. And I liked what, who's this now? Le Bohang said as well, with the intersecting social oppression between the caregiver and the seeker, where they collectively visualize the future. I think that is something that struck me very much as well. I spoke about the model of care, so I'm not going to go back there. And then I'm going to Ntate Chain's reflection as well, where he spoke about the relational loss. Remember, I said that let's look at the relation as well in terms of your identity formation and what loss or lack of identity development Antwone had there. The care seeker, we already said what Jane said in terms of that the care seeker Antwone was never actually the care seeker. The intrapsychic loss, which can also be a loss of a mother, a loss of dignity, a material loss, that is his position and his status in the Navy as well, because remember, status is very important there. And that he might have experienced, if we reflect theologically on this, that he also might have experienced this, his life and his suffering as a punishment from God. And that will relate directly with his view of God. Now, then Fasciola, where she said, that struck me, that eschatological hope, where he wakes up with blood and the bell. And I thought about that. That is quite profound. And I said this morning to a class as well, remember, blood in the Bible, in the Hebrew context, is a symbol of life. So all life starts with blood, and all life ends with the lack of blood. So blood, the river that ran through the paradise as well, was also red in color, and it was the river of life. So blood is a sign of life as well. but also death, because when you lose your blood, then you are dead. And the bell. So think a little bit about that bell. What was the symbolism in a bell? And think of church bells as well. So anyways, and I was just thinking about the crucifixion, Antwone being offered for those around him's sins. That just stuck with me. He and Fasciola also said, he spoke to me, he is used to punishment. So he had a very much of a victim mentality. And I think that is where the change also came when he saw his mother. It's almost as if he lost the victim mentality and gained a survival mentality. Again, with his friend that left him, Jesse, who died, he did not see it as Jesse who lost his life, but that he lost a friend. Again, that victim mentality. And he doesn't feel empowered at all. That is very clear. Then Orabetswe also referred to the Eucharist and the communion. That dream that he had, which was almost a practice run of hope. That was beautiful for me. And also the dinner at Davenport's now, where he saw how a family can be. And so he first dreamed about it, then he went to the dinner at Davenport's house. In the end, it became a reality for him. So that movement and redemption as well. So you cannot think about communion or Eucharist without thinking about redemption. And I also want to know, I want you to explicitly tell me, what was Antwone's life-limiting theology or theologies? What do you think he believed at the end, or at the beginning, his life-limiting theologies? And then show me how that changed into a life-giving theology. So please take note of that. We spoke about boundaries as well. And look at the farm setting, where Colin referred to the farm setting, specifically the cornfields. What's the significance of a cornfield, especially maybe in America? Because what struck me there is that Antwone, the whole movie plays out in a city. Antwone grew up almost in the slums of the city. But this one scene was on a farm. So what does that symbolize? And also where in the dream, that scene, he went to the barn. Now, a barn, we can also have that link to Jesus' birth in the barn, and where the Eucharist and the communion, the festivity took place as well. So that is something you might just think about. And where Davenport does not weave his story with that of Antwone's. That was interesting. Yes, at the end, Davenport gained, but he almost practiced that, respecting the mystery of the other. And what he said is also theological reflection. It starts... The whole movie starts a relationship between the caregiver and the care seeker. It starts with the care seeker, Antwone, slowly starting to trust Davenport, the caregiver. And at the end, it turned around where Davenport trusted Antwone enough to also be vulnerable in front of him. So you see that theme of vulnerability. Okay, I think I've said most of these in class already. Reciprocity is an important thing here. Yes. So yes, if there are any more questions, or even if you just want to post on the group or on WhatsApp to each other, please feel free to do that. And I'm really looking forward to your assessment, to your assignment. So good luck. colleagues, students, crusaders in faith, ambassadors in faith. I will see you again.